everyone for coming, or coming back if you've had a chance to stop and see the show earlier. And I just, before I begin, I also wanted to express my gratitude to the gallery once again, and Michelle, Robin, Yasmin, and Larissa for organizing this second event for us to meet and talk about the show. And also thanks to the artists Justine, Pamila, and Sandra for taking time out of their always busy schedules to travel here and be a part of this. And also a reminder, maybe at the end, that there are, Pamela has some other shows in the city, and Sandra has an exhibition, I think it's further north, that's on right now, so if you're able to travel around a bit. Yeah, as Robin noted, there's a short time to talk before Justine's performance, which we're all looking forward to. So I just wanted to sort of use that time to mostly explore Pamila and Sandra's work. And one of the things that I'll note is that I've worked with them both before at Or Gallery in Vancouver. And so certain configurations, or different configurations of Pamela's work was shown, Sandra's work was shown there in 2019, and Pamela's film was shown there about a year ago, actually. Exactly 1 year ago. And so in terms of sort of the reconfigurations and various installs and exhibitions of these works, I wanted to think about the way that the works are intended or been experienced as like encounters, mediated encounters through art of archival objects, or informally archived objects is probably more the case. And just before I ask them more about those, I will just quickly mention some of the other artists. So of course we're going to see Justine's performance, where there's sort of a body-to-body transfer of archived knowledge. We also have Louis Henderson, who has and I wanted to point out that Louis, the topic of his work is sort of a Haitian figure, Toussaint Louverture, and Louis is a British white filmmaker, and so the interesting fact that he's got Jatif Camille, I'm unfortunately mispronouncing the actor's first name, but a Haitian actor who's kind of the person going through the archives and actually mediating and going through the work and sort of encountering the archives in the work. And then Filipa Cesar, who's a Portuguese artist, is addressing the film archives of Guinea-Bissau and their anti-colonial sort of struggles. And similarly, in her work, she then focuses on the community interaction and conversations around those archives. So rather, again, like focusing on an encounter that is about a community that's more, sort of close to the history or lived through or experienced traumas related to those colonial histories that the encounter with the archive is focused on, rather than artist and archive or viewer and archive. And so keeping that in mind, those other works, I wanted to ask both Pamila and Sandra, maybe we'll start with Sandra, about your intentions for how these objects are mediated in your work and through viewer encounters.
Hello. Is this on? Yeah.
It sounded like it.
Is it on? Yeah? Because I can't tell. This project, Token, Contemporary Ongoing, it started during a residency I was doing at the Art Gallery of Ontario. And upon that residency, I had asked the, my folks who are in contact there if they could give me a tour of the gallery. But I did not only want to see, the different galleries within the space. I wanted to see behind the scenes as well, because I was interested in how installers and, the people who work behind the scenes, how they interact with the art objects in the space. So I remember going into the photography department and experiencing the excitement that those photographers had around the documentation of objects, and also witnessing how much care they were putting into these objects. And immediately, because of the types of themes that I work with, I considered folks in my community, in the Caribbean community living in Toronto, and how they still have this connection with all of these objects that resonate with them because they represent back home. And so I had decided to ask people within the community to, contribute objects that do these things. And I created a series of photographs of them that became photo-based gel transfers. So in some of my work that I do, I create these transfers in which I transfer the image onto another surface. So in this case, it was paper, or I had created these large pieces on walls. And they end up having this weathered and worn look that refers to the past, to memory, possibly to an archive. And I had also, among those pieces, there was one piece that I used, this one object that I used specifically of a broom. And so my mother has this pointer broom that she uses to, or they would use in Guyana to, sweep the floor and such. However, a lot of people in my family, we have this broom just on the kitchen wall and nobody ever uses it anymore. So I just thought about that intention of having something that is, is supposed to be an object to help with cleaning, but we actually keep that object clean instead. And so, so I just started thinking about these things that, we do cherish. We may not use it in the way that it was made, but we cherish them, we keep them for that connection with the past and with another place geographically. Among those pieces, I had also created these series of photographs in the same style that these photographers at the AGO used to document some of the objects in the gallery, especially those that have a lot of details in them. They use a focus stacking software. So I had picked some of these objects and they take images of them from the front to back. So in these pieces, there were about 100 images of the same object that were taken from front to back. And then all of the images are stacked on top of each other so that the image itself is high. It's a very high resolution. It's very clear. And so no aspect of it can be dismissed. And so I just thought of, the interpretive possibilities of that when it comes to ideas of presence and of presence, and a really, I don't know what else to say, but this idea of presence and an undeniable presence in that work. So I think, in other iterations of the exhibition of Token, I would have these plinths with the actual objects within the space, these photographs and various gel transfers on paper or on wall. And I think for many of the people who had contributed the works, the objects, it really, I think for them, it made them look at their objects in another way. They were being elevated and monumentalized. And they were doing this already, but I was attempting to take that intangible feeling that they may have in the object and tangibly show them the magnitude at which they were caring for these objects.
Can I just ask a bit? So for those of you that start the entryway there, so this is part of Sandra's work, and it's interesting that we're talking about like visibility from all sides and 100 images for each object. So on that side, we start, or I guess curatorially, I've made the decision, and with Sandra's permission, to start with like 0 visibility. And so the juxtaposition of the monumentality of this and the visibility and the intimacy of sitting there and having someone talk about their object, and you're seeing it through their memory. Did you want to talk about
sure.
that?
So whenever I went to pick up any of these objects, I'm in people's spaces, right? And so I had asked them to just describe their object, how it feels for them, and I kept it very open. And so people had talked about, you know, their family history. There's one man, Doug, who talks about this powder box that his grandmother has, and he uses it just to hold change, but it used to be this powder box, you know, the baby powder that you put on your chest and such. And I know my mother has a powder box like that. And it's in these discussions, it wasn't only about the object. Like, I learned so much about people's values, their family, where they're from, travels they've done back home. What they shared with me was a true resonance of, you know, the strength of these objects that they have. The piece that, this piece here, the medicinal herbs, that was contributed by a man who is a filmmaker, by Azri Monazir, and he had done a film in Cuba that focused on Haitian descendants. However, none of these people had gone to Haiti, but they still speak Haitian Creole, and they practice certain customs from Haiti. And at the end of his engagement with them, they gave him this bottle of medicinal herbs. And so this was very special for him as a man from Haiti, receiving this from this community of folks. The handkerchief here is from a woman who kept this handkerchief from her grandmother, and her grandmother had passed away. And I love this handkerchief because it's not ironed, it's not pristine, it's always crushed up like this, it has stains on it and such, but she still keeps this handkerchief as something that's really special for her. And it reminded me similarly to the broom I was talking about, in that it's a cleaning piece, but it's kept clean. So it's like the opposite of what this handkerchief is. But yeah, there's so many stories in there. There's this one woman, Renata, who's from Guyana, and she talks about these bangles that she wears on her hands. And when she walks, she hears the bangles jingle, and then she looks around for her mother and then realizes, oh no, I'm wearing these bangles and the sound is coming from me. And it's like I'm carrying my mother everywhere I go. So, yeah. A lot of the stories are really touching. They really represent that, you know, my intentions for the project, that these objects are more than just objects. And even though they're not encased in a huge institution and documented in those ways and such, they still have, you know, as much weight as anything else.
So, yeah, ask on the same question to Pamela about the different iterations of index from base space in Toronto and or gallery in here, and some of the decisions behind shifting how those objects are encountered. And I'll also point out too that both Pamela's objects are from her personal archive, and you might notice a carryover in wall color, and that's also intentional, of pointing out the sort of institutional, sort of archival material, as opposed to the familial archival objects, the informal archival objects that Sandra was just talking about, or the personal archives that Pamela's going to talk about, as well as like mobile, and we were talking a lot about how these things are picked up or brought from back home, or were brought to remind someone of someone back home, as opposed to being in a space or a building or an institution. And so, again, keeping that all in mind, I wanted to pass on the same questions.
Okay, so maybe can we move to
Yeah,
my
do we feel agile enough to kind of move as a group into the back?
I found about 15 years ago now in a refuse place called Arts Junction. And this was an analogous public program, October 1st and 2nd, 1993, to complement Michelle Theriault's project Perspectives, which was a series at the AGO. And that year, 93, Mike Alexier and Lanny Maestro. And I have included the documentation of the objects. I was just talking about Perspectives 93, because that's why this video was made. Okay, so here we are, and this is the AGO material, and there's the catalog. So the librarian and the archivist at the AGO gave me all of this stuff, because I was like, what happened here on October 1st and 2nd, 1993? And they're like, what do you mean? I'm like, I want to know what kind of public program was happening in Walker Court. So I clearly knew that I had these tapes, and they said master and original on them. So they look up the documentation. They're like, for some reason we don't have an audio recording or anything, but we do have some documentation from the opening of Perspectives 93 with Micah and Lenny and the curator. Are you trying to get in touch with them? I said, no, I just want to know what happened. So I totally walked in with this kind of clueless attitude around, like, you know, how am I going to get more information, and how am I going to tell them that I found these tapes in the garbage? So Amy Furness is the current librarian, head of the library services, and the fantastic Marilyn Nazar, who just retired from the AGO Library and Archives, helped me piece together the information. So it wasn't very hard. They knew that this public program happened. They knew that the Perspectives 93 show happened. But when I got into the artist files of Mike Alexier and Lenny Maestro, Micah's file is quite large. Of course, he's a very well-noted artist across, contemporary Canadian artist across Canada. But Lenny, for some reason, is not a household name the way Micah is. And I wasn't trying to pierce the jugular or anything around the museum particularly. I was actually pointing my finger at, like, the entire art system. And what I mean by that is, in Micah and Lanny's file exists all of the reviews, but for some reason, the review that was not very favorable at all was by John Bentley Mays. And if anybody recalls John Bentley Mays, he kind of made or broke your career. And he sold papers, right? Like, I would, as a young artist, I would run out and buy the Saturday paper to read his reviews. Everybody did. The entire community did. It was what we did in Toronto, right? So, but that was the days of publishing and papers, and the print culture has changed a lot. It's online now. But also, we have also figured out that perhaps we don't have to be so mean. that's as simply as put. And what I ended up doing was I took 7 minutes of the tape Identity in the Foreign Place, and there's a writer named Lakshman Gill on it who happens to be of Filipino and Punjabi Sikh descent, which I'm also a member of the Punjabi Sikh community here. And I was like, why would they program this person? But the program was put together by Goethe Institute and the AGO. It was a collaborative program. And you know, in the beginning of the tape, we hear Matthew Taiwan talking about the unfortunate underfunding of Harbourfront Centre, and everybody has to gather around public art and public art spaces and whatnot. And I thought it was really funny because I was just like, oh, well, you know, Harbourfront always seems to have this iteration of decade after decade, like some sort of strife with either the federal government or the community or the members of the staff or whatever. It's like it's not free of that kind of pain. And I pretty much was laser focused on John Bentley Mays' article where he calls Mike Alexier like near Caravaggio and Rembrandt. And if you look at the work in the show, there's nothing like Caravaggio and Rembrandt. And I'm like, what is this guy smoking? But he's dead now, right? So, of course, now we can talk about him without feeling like he's going to come for us. But because you just didn't want to get on his bad side. So then he says about Lenny Maestro that she's whining. And that, basically the word that's not used in the article and by him is that there is trauma, historical trauma in the Philippines around how many different imperialists have pretty much colonized the Philippines. And she talks a little bit about that. But what I could tell, and I'm not a psychologist or a psychiatrist, I can tell that there's a sadness in those 7 minutes of her that I use because she is near a PhD. But right now, Lakshmi Gill teaches ESL in Vancouver somewhere, and she raised her 2 children. So she got, from the research I did, she got up to her master's, fine, but she came up to Canada and started her PhD program, but for some reason she did not finish her PhD program. I don't know why, but she teaches ESL in Vancouver right now. So I would have to say something about the system that did not help propel this person. It's a failure to launch, right? Whether it was personal, but the point being is that the institution failed this individual, this academic. And I say this as an educator, because I teach high school by day, and I see what happens when K-12 system basically does not know how to support, in fact, presents more and more barriers on those individuals. And what happens when they go to post-secondary, because my students tend to come back to me, the racialized ones, and queer trans ones, and black and indigenous ones, who say, I'm going to quit. I'm done. And I'm like, why is this the cycle of the institution that they can't seem to get young BIPOC students into 3rd and 4th year? Like, they want to quit after either the 1st or 2nd year. And I was going to do a master's about it, but at OIC, but they declined me. So I have a relationship to failure, a very strong relationship to failure. But when I fail from school, my report cards are horrible, and whatnot, and I don't really consider myself an academic, but I do somehow, I'm adjacent to academia, very much so, and this became a project in which I started to collect Index Sum of All Parts, that's the name of the title of the video, where I am looking particularly at feminist, BIPOC artists from 2-3 generations, and why the system just keeps failing them. So in that tape, the tape not in that tape, another program that happened was with Homi Baba and Jamili Hassan and Monica King-Gagnon, who's here at Concordia. And in that conversation, and it's about looking at, I guess before they had the word diversity all over the place, but what they're talking about is basically how the system doesn't really know how to review artists like me, or support artists like me, like whether it's curating, whether it's reviewing or writing. But at the end of the day, and I'm going to just stop that paragraph right there, sidebar, is that it's my role as an artist is to create the art history. Your role is to curate it and write about it and think about it. That's the way it goes, right, folks? And why is it that the system just keeps repeatedly failing artists like me, or curators like Denise or whatnot, or reviewers like who don't get published and whatnot, right? So I don't need to really spell out anti-oppression, but that is pretty much like a lot of the issues that I am circulating in. So then along comes my archive. I only owned 10 artists of color, Black, Indigenous, and racialized artists in my collection. But when A-Space came knocking to this opportunity to do this show, I dug out all the stuff that I've been waiting to work with in my now almost 30-year career. I started at age 20 and I'm turning 50 this year. So, and I was like, I want to see what's on these tapes. And that's basically how I got to here. And I'm using my family archive, those 10 works, and then I commissioned more artists for the A-Space show. But in this video, I'm using items that I've personally, that's my first Punjabi language workbook. That's Sam Tata, who the National Gallery has some of his work. And that's, a postcard that French Museum did. These guys are very controversial. They're called Sikh activists, but basically because of these two individuals, they actually blew up Flight 185, the Air India bombing that happened. And they made those bombs in Duncan's, BC. So, the government didn't even recognize them as Canadians. They kept saying, oh no, it's India's problem, this flight that went down. 328 people died, no, it's India's problem, because it was Air India. How simple is that oversight, that these are actually Canadians who were blown up? And that's a Canadian press photographer calling them activists. So one person's activist is another person's terrorist, right? And that is the first large large body of members of South Asian community that died here on Turtle Island, or off of Turtle Island when the plane was found on the coast of, is it Ireland? Yeah. So, and these are items where I have purchased them. So press photography, or archival photographs or traditional photographs where I am looking at reclaiming the gaze, like Warren and Shepherd had the oldest colonial, like I guess it was, yeah, they were around from like early 1900s, late 1800s, and they were the last to close their shop in, I think, Calcutta. And, you know, so there was a lot of history where they would not just photograph Indian Raja, Maharajas and whatnot. That's Lakshmi Gill, who I'm talking about. And so I know I'm compacting like years and years and years of the story into this little 10, 15 minutes, but you can ask questions. There's my, does that look like Caravaggio or Rembrandt? No, right? And that's what he called it. And I was just like, are you kidding me? But that was Marilyn Nazar, like, pushed me into looking at the artist files, and she was like, just sit down and look through these files. And I was like, okay. And that's my first crush. It's just like my mom's bed sheets and 2 little side table lamps. She wanted to be a model. I wanted to photograph her in my mom's basement. So it's an artwork. Now, this is an article I found online of Monica Diol and her sisters. And I use her as like a, I guess she's like the anti-hero, because, I mean, I can tell you that a lot of kids my age, we would be dancing because we weren't into, you know, we weren't legal to go to clubs. So Friday night and Saturday afternoons, when it switched from Friday night to Saturday afternoons, we'd be dancing with Electric Circus. So I think that to me is a success story, because Moses Sniber found her in a club in Winnipeg. She was in a punk band. She DJ'd, and they brought her to Toronto. She had absolutely no journalism background or media arts like background. She was just a DJ that he was like, hey, you're going to look great on TV. And she was like, okay, from what the story goes. So, yeah. So this is going to be turned into a book. It's a video installation, and my first and last iteration, I'm coming 5 years to close the installation. It's a feature show at Pamila Matharu Art Museum and Archives in May, in just outside of Toronto. So, so yeah, that's it, and I hope you can make it. Thank you.
Still a little bit more time? Another question? Or I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to open it up to any questions that you all might have. But you know, I was walking. I'm staying up by Luquan, and I was walking here, and had walked past like one of their many buildings, and could see, you know, first I saw these tables with like those like large loops, you know, that magnify and light that you look at archival stuff with, and then the desk, and then inevitably the flat files, like all of the trappings of an archival room, and sort of that started me thinking about, not just because I'm coming here, but sort of the ritual of going into archives, institutional archives, you know, experiencing them very different from this, and just how much distancing is done with all of these materials, whether it's microfiche and, you know, just in the interest of preserving material and keeping those. And, you know, it's, for those of you that have read the exhibition essay, that's really very much what I'm also interested in with this project, is, you know, writers like Denise Ryner who talks about against the separation of the then, there, and the here, now, and how archives, institutional archives, kind of attempt to keep that distance through, you know, where we encounter them, how we, you know, what's kept, what's not kept, as Pamela sort of addressed. And it was interesting where Sandra had spoken about the woman who she wears these objects and feels like is looking for her mother immediately, like they kind of really overlap, the then, there, and the here, now existences. And so I wanted to ask a bit more about that, so sort of getting out of the, you know, well, you sort of get into the very specifics of the art world, but but just, I mean, this is very much your archive. We're talking about your personal
Yes.
relationship to everything.
Yeah.
There's also kind of a broad thinking about sort of diasporas and histories. Again, at the OR installation, there were some newspapers that you found and
That's right.
installed about earlier communities, South Asian communities.
Because why did I do that? It was 1909, 1914, and 1947. I found 3 editions of the Nelson Daily News from BC, which they're still around, but it's a different name. And in the fall to winter of 2018, the Punjabi Sikh community was put on a federal watch list. Now, we always get thrown back on this list when they think that there's terrorist activity or alleged terrorist activity happening in our community. But you know, at the end of the day, like, I don't see all white people being, like, you know, interrogated for, well, name any white person who's done any murdering or terrorism or anything like that. But the point being is that why are we constantly being badgered by state institutions? And that's why I decided to mash up my archive. And I really wanted to, like, frustrate institutional people. And some of them were like, why did you tack this up on the wall? It's like, yeah, my show, you can't say anything. And the point was that, you know, all my understanding and my years of my lived experience in the visual arts sector, I was playing with that as materiality. And whether I was looking at proper journalist sources, like, it's about sourcing, right? So whether those were my collage or the Black Lives Matter, you know, like, basically, what's that called? Ephemera that I keep, but, like, that's Born in Shepherd, that's Born in Shepherd. So I've put money into this, and then also putting the museum framing and whatnot. And the idea here is that I don't want, you know, as my time increases on Turtle Island, I don't want to necessarily always think of Margaret Bourke-White's images of partition in Life magazine when I think of myself in the media or my history. So those are the papers that Denise is referring to, the Daily News. And Amrita Shergill's there. She's the first modern female artist from India. But then also things that colonial corporate photographers were doing. And then this is a cigarette card from Churchman Cigarette, and that's Maharaja Ranjit Singh's throne, which isn't a V&A, but it's a cigarette card. A lot of people don't know that 1.6 million Indians were in the World War I and II, like, you know, so that we've spent time, you know, fighting. So I'm really working with perspective, for me, my perspective, but also the audience's perception of who I am. You know how annoying it is when you meet folks who are not South Asian or not Punjabi, and they'll be like, can you give me a good Indian restaurant recommendation? And I'm like, do I look like Blog TO here? Like, no, I can't, you know? But the idea there is I'm being playful with stereotypes too. So, you know, I'm conflating press photography with commercial advertising, right? Because you think you see us, but where have you seen us, right? There's a Wealth Simple ad that I don't think is there. This is a corporate calendar, but it's also using Fulgari, which is from my home state in Punjab. This is my mom's first object she bought, leaving India on her Air India flight out from India to the UK to marry my dad. This is my father's handwriting, but it's also photographs, and it's also the weekend of independence that it's stamped. This is AGFA. So you can see where I'm going. I'm using the personal and political, and I'm really mixing that up, right? It's not any strategy that I know in art, it's my strategy. That's my grandfather, my Nanaji, in front of Lee's photo, which is now Nadej Pastries in Toronto. But this was I found in my family archive that he was on Queen Street, right? So I'm using history, but I'm talking about the traces of history, whether it's generation after generation in my family, whether it is generation after generation as a cultural producer. And Jamili says in the audio tape that Marilyn gave me, you know, it was such a gift of that talk that Jamili says, you know, every generation pretty much follows the traces of the previous generation in the arts, the visual arts, right?
So this is Jamili Hassan?
Hassan, yeah. And I truly feel that is true, right? There's so many things. I saw Surinder Dhaliwal this week, who is, you know, senior to me. She's just a little younger than my mom. But, you know, people often will look at my text-based work or my collage-based work and, oh, Pamela uses text and photography like, or use photo-based strategies like Pamela. No, you know, there's now 3-4 generations of South Asian Canadian artists that you can actually say, like, this is a affiliation, this is a citation, you know? And I guess that's my feminist citation, because people will say, well, why do you call it a feminist work? And I'm like, well, I'm using those strategies that art history has given me, or studio art practice, whatever you want to call it, the arts, and I'm using it through my lens. So I'm really reclaiming, when I say I'm returning the gaze, which is the name of a Hamani Banerjee book. She's a Canadian sociologist. She's still alive and well, but she's a prolific sociologist, Marxist social feminist. You know, people around the world, sociology academics, come to see her and hear her. And I think York still, even though she's retired, they still give her sections of grad students to work with. You know, so, but that's not common knowledge, right? So yeah, you can definitely, like, my background is in social science and visual arts, contemporary arts, so that's what I'm using strategy-wise.
Pamela's in the back corner. Did you want to speak to the, similarly, like, against the, I guess, the distancing of archival through various practices, or maybe before?
Well, a lot of what Pamela is saying, I remember, like, in the 90s when, you know, you would see an article in a paper, and I remember there was an exhibition of Black artists that were showing somewhere north of Toronto. And Gary Michael Dalt, when he wrote about it, he talked about it as if these artists were invading these well-mowed lawns of the neighborhood and such, like this mysterious, magical show of these radical artists, when it was an exhibition of works within a common theme, and the artists were Black artists. So there were a lot of these types of, these articles that were just inaccurate and such that were happening. I think that when I was going through these times, there was a lot of collectives that we formed and curating that we did, a lot of artist talks that we would just do on our own. We were not working with institutions because we recognized that, you know, it was almost hopeless. It was basically hopeless to try to get into any of them. And so we would create our own communities within Toronto. I also used to put these exhibitions on at my house. The first year I had 150 people. The last year we did, there were like 500 people who came through, and I showed 26 artists. And the way that we did it, we would exhibit the works of artists. The majority of the artists were Black artists, but I would talk about it as artists of the Junction and Junction Triangle area. And so when people came, you would see that there are these artists who are also living and working within the same spaces as all these other artists. In my neighborhood where I was living, or where I'm living, there were these actions, these art actions that were happening to enliven the neighborhood, but we would never see any artists of color or Black artists within these exhibitions. And so, you know, we would create these initiatives. I think my strategy is more so of centering our stories and who we are and our presence within spaces. I think that's why I do these large pieces on the wall. It is also to nod towards the presence within these spaces, the fact that it is known historically that certain communities were not welcome in those spaces. It wasn't like, you know, right now you can see that there's a little bit more diversity within these spaces, but there's still a lot of work to be done and who runs these spaces as well. So I think that, yeah, so that my strategy in general, I would say within all of my series, all of the work that I do, it is maybe not an overt, although for me it is overt, but it's not an overt commentary on the art politics of the day or the lack of spaces for people, but there is a nod. There is something that's going on always in the work that would tell you where my position is, right?
Yeah, and I think for me, like, a space came to me in my 25th year of practice. And when that happened, I was working with a youth-led feminist art collective that I co-founded. And it was like an after-girls school club that I turned into a contemporary art project, a collective called Boner Kill. And Boner Kill, we got shut down because the name was found harmful to racialized trans women of color. So we obviously had to listen, we couldn't argue around that. And then I just flipped it into Sister Co-Resistor, but then it became a platform project in which I invited underrepresented female artists, non-binary artists. And when I got this opportunity, that was around the time when we dissolved Boner Kill. So then Vicky Paul from A-Space said, well, it'll just be you. Now, how do I count 25 years where I've constantly been in relation, adjacent, in community with other folks, right? So a lot of my early days were spent curating, and it wasn't by choice. It was around staying active, being, you know, having a livelihood, being relevant and whatnot. And, but I made a concerted effort after I started this project called Come Up to My Room with Christina Zeiler, and her family owned the Gladstone Hotel, and I did about 5 years of curating of that, and then I was like, Christina, we're never going to stop curating if we don't pull ourselves out of the show. And it was very much about design art and art design and, you know, transforming this hotel into installation projects and whatnot. It was fun. I had a great time. But you know, like, sometimes you got to stop a good thing, even though, like, you know, you don't have to be the first one at the party and the last one to leave, right? So I wanted to pass the baton on. And that's what I often do with projects. And, but I also needed to make a concerted effort around getting back to my practice. But then it was like, nobody in the Canadian Toronto art world was like even realizing that I was a maker, that I was an artist thinker. They just assumed that I wanted to be this curator. And I was like, no, I didn't go to art school, studio art program to be a curator. My intention was to be an artist, and I worked in gallerists and private dealers and philanthropists and all that stuff, except not an auction house. That's the one last thing I have to try. But, and now I teach, and, you know, I was telling Vicky, like, why, like, in some ways laughing and crying at the same time, saying, why has it taken 25 years for this solo? And then I was like, Vicky, why has it taken 25 years? You know, my anger and rage, Audre Lorde says, like, you know, anger is useful, and it was. And she was like, channel into your project, Pamela. And I was like, Vicky, you are my art doula. You're gonna help me give birth to this project. And between Vicky and my psychiatrist, really, is how I got this project made, that show you saw, Denise, A-Space. And it was out of anger and rage, but what I did is I gave Toronto flowers. I didn't necessarily take John's, one room was the documents, I called it, and the other room was about celebration and joy and reverence around my artist community, particularly the artists of color community, Black, Indigenous, and racialized artists that I ended up commissioning, willfully commissioning, taking my, so one of the strategies of Boner Kill, no, not Boner Kill, but Sister Co-Resistor, is that we redistribute our funds. Whenever we're asked into an institution, we just literally take the fee and flip it and cut it whatever ways. It's very Marxist that way. And, you know, sometimes young artists would be like, why are we only getting $100 and you're splitting it 10 ways? Like, meaning they're getting $10 to do the show. And they were like, that's all we got, you know? And I was not necessarily being mean or anything. It was just more like, you can be an artist, but you have to consider your economy of means. You know? So learn how to make something out of virtually nothing or like a very low budget. And, you know, I think that skill set will be with them for a very long time. And they're now, half of them are practicing, half have gone into their own, route of whatever choice they want to do career-wise. But it was really fun, you know. And it's interesting because when I got, so I guess things happen in threes. Like I had an offer prior to this show, I got an offer to be an artist in residence because I was actually quite upset when Leela Timon said to me, we were both reviewing portfolios at Ryerson and we're at the little drinks thing, and Lysenka said, and she's like, you're everywhere. I'm like, no, my labor is everywhere. I sit on boards, I do equity committee work, I do hiring committee work, I do public program work, I consult on a lot of things. A lot of unpaid labor is everywhere in the city. And that is what I summed up. So I made this neon work, and it says girls, 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 but the title of it is invited to the party but never asked to dance, which is it's a phrase that's used by equity consultants. Invited to the party but never asked to dance, meaning you're asked to sit at the table, but don't talk. Don't offer anything, but you know, you perform your role in representation around that board table, but we don't want to hear the real truth. And then you're the first one out the door, right? Because you're like, okay, to hell with this. I can't, you know, if your board's not going to listen. And there's only so much labor you can do around that piece, right? Like, if you're asking me to help decolonize or indigenize or like make it more representative, more equity-based inclusionist strategies, and then you're not listening, then I don't know who's failing here, me or you, like as an institution. So, like I was on 5 boards in 12 years. Who does that?
Just a note about it in terms of like the reverberations of your labor and Sandra's and the projects you spoke about, Motor Co-Sister, Co-Resistor, and Open House, which is the events that Sandra did at her place. Those, I got to know your work and through what was Motor Co before and then through Open House. I don't remember how I got there, but that's how I met Sandra and kind of developed a lot of my, I guess, curatorial practice and thinking about communities I didn't have access to, again, through regular institutions, was informed through those projects. Yeah. So it is a lot of labor, but if anything can make you feel that it's not wasted, yeah, I just wanted to mention that.
Yeah, and a lot of that work we've learned, organizing and community work, we've learned from our elders. They did the organizing in church groups and mosques and gurdwaras and mandars and stuff like that. We watched them organize as a community when they came here as very new immigrants. So then you use those same strategies into the arts, and it's beautiful, right? So yeah, Open House is something, and Sandra and I, you know, we both went to York and whatnot. We both worked in the visual arts sector, like hardcore, you know, commercial galleries and whatnot. So it's not like we didn't know the strategies. We're just waiting. Remember, Sandra, you told me we're just waiting.
You know? There's also something about not waiting and just doing.
Just doing, exactly. Now we don't wait, we just do it.
Not, right? So, but I mean, I remember watching Loophole Retreat, you know, Simone Lee's project in Venice. And I remember that some of these women were talking about the amount of labor that they do. There was this one woman, I'm sorry, I can't remember her name, but I remember she was saying, you know, the burden that we carry of having to do all of this extra work. However, at the end of the day, the satisfaction is just so unsurmountable. I remember Lorraine Grady when she was saying, you know, when I do my work, I wonder, am I complicit with, I'm maybe using the wrong words, with the intentions of institutions So what she always thinks about is, who is the audience? Why am I doing this work? And who can I bring up so that they can also create work freely for our audiences? Mm-hmm. So I've always, so I think about these things all the time. And I want to enjoy creating. I love making art. I love mediums. I love going on scaffolding. I love working close up on the wall. I love seeing what the result is when you back up. Yep. I love choosing certain imagery, figuring out what my subject matter is. I remember when I realized what my overall theme was throughout my practice, and that allowed me to be confident with all of the other decisions I make when it comes to what am I making, what is the project, what images I'm going to use. I just love making work. And so I have to really love what I'm looking at when I'm creating it. And so I have to find, I want to feel that joy. And so I do so, hopefully, my intention is winning, but I do so by centering me and the people who I want to relate to the subject matter of the work. Right? I wouldn't be able to make if I wasn't doing that.
We have a few more minutes before Justine's ready for her performance.
Sorry, just to say about 5 minutes.
About 5 minutes.
Our videographer is working double duty.
Okay, yes.
To set up.
Okay, so I just wanted to open it up to questions, and then also we'll have a bit of a break before the performance so that the camera can set up. So are there any questions for the artists, or if you have questions about the other works, I can try to answer those as well. And sort of just to go off of what Sandra was saying, like bringing it back to Philippa's work, where the whole thing is ostensibly about this film archive, but then you watch it and what it's really about is the community gatherings around the archive and the filling in the blanks with the filmmakers and the memories of being in those independent struggle era, and just the focus on those conversations. And I think I keep going back to it. I think it's in the essay, but Sana Nahada, one of the filmmakers, talking about the oxen and how it's seen in different parts of Guinea-Bissau, and it kind of connects to Sandra's broom as well. Like in one part of the country, the oxen are revered and you don't put them to work. They're you keep them and you honor them. And then the other part of the country, they're made for preparing the field and as an agricultural sort of assistance. And it's it's interesting to hear about the way you, Pamela, and you, Sandra, talk about your art practices, like in going in between like the sort of institutional or gallery or presentational practice, but then also all of these, all of the work in the background on boards, or just informally mentoring, and creating spaces, alternative spaces, or just working in the two ways, preparing the field, as it were. So yeah, thanks again for coming back to talk about this and sharing these histories.
Thank you, Michelle.
And I'm just scanning for any. Okay, there.
It's not a question because you've given us so much time already, and thanks so much, both of you, really fascinating. I just wanted to say it's incredibly well, like your piece is really striking in how you use verticality and the slight movements. They've just been like, I have lots of questions, but there's already so much that's been shared.
No, we can talk after.
But I just thought there's no sound right now, but it's like I'm hearing something in the rhythm, and I work with media, and you know this, but it's just very, very original, and it's a very striking way of using the
Thank you so much.
archive. And a piece I'm thinking of is Arthur Jafa's Apex, which I'm not familiar, but
yes,
a lot of things you said.
I love Arthur Jafa.
Because
I love him so much. I met him at Creative Time, and he said something so profound, and it really changed the way I used to think about Black thought and Black creativity, because we all, who doesn't love Beyonce? When you want to get in a good mood, you put that Spotify mix on. We Renaissance, you know, kill it. And this is what he said, which is, it was so simple but so profound, which is, how can you love Black culture but not care about Black life? Meaning, you don't have one iota of, you witness it all the time around anti-Black racism, and now Black death, since we've been learning since George Floyd, but then you have, like, it's just like you shrug your shoulders, right? So where can you put your dollars, or your, where can you put your solidarity, right? And I don't know, allyship kind of makes me cringe. It's accomplishing that you have to think about, which is, because the thing is, the members of the community in question will always ask you to come in as an ally. You don't self-appoint yourself an ally. Nobody gets up in the morning and goes, oh, what kind of allyship we're going to do today? It's more like, who am I going to help support, right? That's why I didn't use sound, because he uses sound is so instrumental in his practice. In fact, it shapes the way he sees and how he curates, self-selects and edits and whatnot. He definitely, I'm sure he spends hours looking at YouTube, hours, you know, the way he looks at materiality of Black life and Black culture, particularly, and that becomes the very, it's so thick, it's very thick ethnographic work, you know, and I did definitely learn from his talk that year at Creative Time, and I think you can find it on YouTube. But yeah, that's something that he shared that I then decided, I don't need sound, based on how he talks about sound in the video too, yeah. And I worked with 2 different editors. I gave Denise 2 versions, right?
Yeah.
I paid 2 editors. I said, here you go. What can you do? So one editor made this, and one did a very slower version, I think 26 minutes or something. This is 11 minutes.
Yeah, it's because everything would pop up and then
yes,
sit
and
on
then
the
kind
screen for a
of,
bit.
so that was very much like, I didn't want to emulate PowerPoint, but it was very much like a slow fade or a slow album kind of like looking, very much a close looking, whereas this is like some purposely going fast, but then it slows down and speeds up, slows down, and yeah, that's it.
Should we maybe wrap it up? Or
Any other questions?
I think it's a thank you.
Thank you so much, Robin.
Denise and Pamela and Sandra, for everything you shared about your work and conversation. It's a long conversation that we've been having between the 3 of you, and that relationship and what they've been doing together. Absolutely wonderful conversation. So thank you.